Just press live. Hello, welcome everybody to Science Division Live. My name's Jose Zuniga, and I'm one of the science educators here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Carlton Shield Chief Gover, our expert today, who is going to be sharing some of our collections from the JonesMiller collection. Without further ado, Carlton, please take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So today, everyone, I'm going to be showing you the JonesMiller Paleoindian archaeological collection. Now, the JonesMiller Site, or 5YM8, is located near Ray, Colorado. This site was excavated back over a 3-year period from the summer of 1972 to the summer of 1973 to 1975. This site has over 41,000 bison bones, which represent nearly 300 animals. And to show you what that looks like, we have a plan view map of the excavation itself. Now, each one of these squares is 2 meters by 2 meters. So you can get a really good estimate for the size of the site. And so this is how they used to put photos together. So each one of these units represents a photograph that they took back in the 1970s, where one poor graduate student was hefted up a ladder and held in place by a bunch of football players so they can get these photographs from an aerial view. And then they stitched all these together. So you can see a huge concentration of bison bones here and some scatterings elsewhere along the site. So now this site, sorry, I'm trying to turn the camera. The bison that are present at this site were not killed in place. They were processed at what we call the JonesMiller Site. And you can tell by looking at that map, you can't really see a bison skeleton in there. It is just piles and piles of bones. Now, using techniques of basically, we all know every animal has one left mandible or one cranium. So counting up those sort of skeletal features, they came up with an estimate that there are nearly 300 bison antiquus, specifically located at this site. This site, based on the projectile points, hell gap points, the site is roughly 11,500 years ago to 10,000 years ago. And the reason why we mean by based off of the points is these are what we call hell gap points. This collection here. So at the JonesMiller site, over 200 projectile points were found, but only about 20 were found complete or near complete. And these are called hell gap points because these style of points, projectile points, were found first at a site called Hell Gap near Guernsey, Wyoming. It is the Hell Gap site. It is a National Historic Landmark. So this site was found later and recognized that these points also belong the same characteristics, and this is based on the shape of these points. Now, these points are made out of different materials. So we have flat top flint, which I can show you. I pulled out a little collection here. So these points here, let's get some sunlight. This is flat top flint. This is found in Nebraska. You have different types of charts and quartzites found in the Hartville Uplift near Guernsey, Wyoming, and it's basically represents eastern Wyoming up into the Black Hills. It's orange, has this speckled, these black specks found inside. And then you also get Smoky Hill jasper, which is this really nice deep red color. And this is found in northern Kansas and southern Nebraska. So you have, and also interestingly enough, one point here in the collection is made out of petrified wood found in the Texas Panhandle. So we have raw material for these points coming all over the Rocky Mountain Front Range and closer to the Missouri River. So we believe that to represent the people that hunted these bison, collected materials, and were nomadic. Now, also with these points, as you'll notice, they have a bunch of different sizes. So they're all the same kind of point, but they get smaller. And that's because when you break a point, so let's say that tip breaks off, you resharpen the point using tools such as antler tines. You can pressure flake. If your point breaks, you just make it smaller. And if it breaks again, you can make it smaller again. And the way this works, right, is you pressure flake these edges of a point. This is something I made from home. And it can resharpen the edges just by pressing down on them and resharpening the tools. To half the points themselves, oftentimes you'd see Paleoindian flint knappers. You halved an arrow shaft. So this is an arrow foreshaft. You connect the two, and then you wrap the point onto the foreshaft using sinew. And then you let the sinew dry, and you have yourself a projectile. So we know the site was at least used twice. So there's two different butchering events happening. And the way we can tell that without radiocarbon dating is by looking at the bison mandibles, specifically looking at the molars and the eruption patterns of the molars. You know how teenagers, they get wisdom teeth that grow in at a certain time, all the youths that have children, you know, adult teeth also come in at a certain time. Well, the same thing is for bison. And by basically looking at the mandibles, especially from juvenile mammoth, like this one here, or not mammoth, sorry, bison, juvenile bison like this one here, you can get a sense of when the kill events occurred. So bison only have offspring in the spring. And so at this site, you have bison that are 3 months old, but you also have bison that are 9 months old, so not fully a year, which has led archaeologists that worked on this site originally to believe that there's a spring kill, or sorry, a summer kill, and then a fall or early winter kill, based on looking at how the molars have erupted in many of these bison. Now, there's only one bison crania that's nearly intact. The majority of these bones present within the JonesMiller site are heavily butchered. The Paleoindians at the site would kill the bison and basically assembly line, taking off the meat, getting access to calorie-rich bone marrow, specifically in the long bones. So a lot of these bones are shattered, right? So we have that's how you end up with over 3,000 bone fragments, which only represent maybe 300 bison themselves. It's evidence of how Paleoindians, even as early as 11,000 years ago, were utilizing many portions of bison. And so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions concerning the JonesMiller archaeological site.
That is so fascinating. Yes, if you are, you have questions for Carlton, please post them in the comments. We will try to answer as many of those questions as we can. Just to get the ball rolling, Carlton, I have a question
Mhm.
for you. What can the amount of bones and the amount of artifacts found tell us about the population of these peoples at this time? Were there large
Ooh.
bands with thousands of people? Were there settlements? Were there just small family groups, a handful of individuals? What really does the evidence suggest?
Exactly. That's a really good question. So the amount of artifacts doesn't really tell us about populations that were present. Like there's over 200 points, but only 20 are complete. And the reason being is when something breaks, especially like a point, if it broke in the midsection and it's no longer usable, you just throw it away. So, archaeology is essentially we're just digging through ancient people's trash. So they keep their good points. So like the 20 good points we have were probably lost by accident, not on purpose. So it's hard to kind of just tell by projectile points how many people were there. And we don't have pottery at this time, which is a good food storage indicator, which is a really good way to figure out how much population. Um, the bison bones themselves, also not a great indicator, because oftentimes at these Paleo-Indian kill sites, they would kill entire herds. So, and you're talking about small scale hunting and gathering societies, so maybe a couple dozen people. At larger events like Head Smashed in Alberta, Canada, a couple, maybe 1,000 or so people would come and be a big group event. But here at JonesMiller, we haven't even found the camp that these people stayed at. So we have really no great, like good idea of how many people were present. We just have where they butchered their animals. And as anyone that camps, especially here in Colorado, knows, you got to put your food away or else the bears will get to it or other carnivores. So these people did not stay close at night to where they had, a couple hundred rotting animals essentially. So that's one of the questions of JonesMiller that we hope to answer maybe through future excavations at the site.
So, furthering along that, we had a question in the comments. Are there any other artifacts that were found at the site? And were there any other animals that were found butchered at the site, or was it only bison?
So interestingly enough, we do find canid remains at the site. So probably coyote, we don't know for sure. They are present. They don't look to be butchered. So it could have been scavenging events afterwards in which a coyote or so was killed in fighting for bones. There's also a dog burial present, but that's a couple thousand years later near the site. So they're not related, just kind of happenstance that a group of ancestral indigenous people buried a dog near the site or into it. The other kinds of artifacts that were found, we do have a lot of gastropods, meaning like mollusks, snails, and we use those to reconstruct the paleo environment, particularly because certain snails only live in certain areas, and even their ancestors did. So we've kind of looked at the proportions of snails, and we know because of the snail density or the kinds of snails present. Actually, I have a kind of, this is fortuitous. We have oversized images of the snails that were present. And through these, we're able to figure out that it was a wetter environment. We're talking about at the end of the ice age. So it wasn't as nearly dry as it was now today. So there's a couple bone tools, so tools made out of bones, a lot of chipstone. So when you make projectile points, you have a lot of debitage or residual rocks that come off of it. Tons of that, of course, thousands and thousands of flakes and thousands of bone fragments. And that's what we have.
That's so interesting. Snails is not what would occur to me to think about reconstructing a an ancient environment, but it makes sense. It makes sense. Um, Now, when you talk about all of this, the flaking, because I know when you make these sort of obsidian tools, there is a lot of flaking involved, and you had shown us those antler tips in that example you made. is these flakes that we find at this site, I should say, are these flakes that we find at this site evidence that the tools were being made at the site prior to the hunt, or is it more likely that these are repairs that are happening while the butchering is going on?
Both. So definitely you have a quantity of flakes. It's hard for us to reconstruct that. Think of a really, really bad jigsaw puzzle. That's really difficult. It's hard to kind of piece flakes together. So you have resharpening, but also rather than coming prepared with a bunch of complete points or knives, more often than not, Paleoindians and people throughout time and space, they had, we call them preforms or blanks. So basically they're almost ready, but depending on what you need, you can make a knife real quick. You can make a Hellgat point. They're basically like ready to go to be whatever you need them to be. So they don't have many diagnostic features because it's just a lancet looking projectile point that isn't fluted, doesn't have notches in it. And you can turn it into a bunch of different things. So you'll find these a lot at some, what we call like cache sites, or where you find basically a bundle full of arrowheads, and they'll have a bunch of preforms in there. So you'll see a lot of that too, that they'll be flaking things what they need. There isn't much raw material. There isn't raw material at all really out in Ray, Colorado. So the flakes that we do have, like they're probably finishing points. They're not they're not taking like 20 pounds of rock from the Texas Panhandle, right? We don't have horses yet. We don't really have evidence for dogs being used as pack animals at this point in time. So, for the amount of debitage that is there, it's definitely looks more like they're resharpening tools and making tools from preforms.
Interesting. Is there evidence at this JonesMiller site that this was a site you had talked about when you looked at the bison molars breaking through, that you see two different ages, which suggests that they're coming at different times of the year? Is there also evidence to suggest that this is a site that was returned to over a period of years or decades, or was this just a one and done hunt? We've gotten what we need and we're going to move on.
Yeah, we don't know. The bison are found on top of each other. So we have no idea if they returned in the summer that same year or if it was years ago, but the previous kill was still exposed. And so that's one of the research projects that we're looking here in the Department of Anthropology, is we want to redate the site. There's only 3 radiocarbon dates associated, one of which is on the dog burial, but we want to do a systematic redating of the site to test that hypothesis. If we can see through radiocarbon that maybe they came to the site a couple decades later, but if they came within the same year or even 5 years, it will be impossible for us to tell with the margin of error of radiocarbon dating today. But still, that still tells us an interesting question. We know the site was used at least twice. And if radiocarbon dating can't find that separation, that means a single generation of hunters knew about the site and came back to it at some point during their lifetimes.
Yeah, interesting. I could see the benefit also too of not doing it in the same place year after year because of that scavenging predator. Predators, scavengers, they tend to have really good and long memories, and I could see that would be a very dangerous situation as well.
Right, and bison migrate.
That's true. Bison do migrate, so maybe they just are not back there.
Exactly.
Lots of factors to take into account. We have another question from the comments for you. Carlton, what has been the most surprising thing that you've discovered while working with this collection?
The earliest, I think, being able to see a shell bead. So at the time this was excavated, this bead was the earliest known shell bead. So this shell, I believe, came from one of the coasts. I can't remember if it's the Gulf Coast or LA. And you can tell that based on the shell itself. So it was kind of cool to see during the 70s, the big hype was they had found this really early shell bead that they hadn't seen before. So that was really interesting to come across, as well as I mean, just kind of from a nerdy perspective, the petrified wood point, you don't see many of those. So being able to see that was pretty cool. I tried to find it, but there's, over 200 points and, you know,
I imagine that's a little bit like a sharp point in a haystack, not necessarily.
yes.
So. Uh, that's really interesting that the shell bead you say came from either the Gulf Coast or the Pacific near LA. I mean, that's thousands and thousands of miles away from this site. So
Yes.
that suggests that there was some sort of trade or migration going on that is pretty incredible at the time. That's really
Yes, absolutely.
well, we'll wrap up here with one final question. What 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 are you hoping to achieve by studying this collection? And then by a greater extension, what do you think we still have to discover from this collection?
So this site was never published. It was excavated in the 70s. There's one, if you're interested, there's like one little article in Plains Anthropologist that was published in, I think it was 78. And the archaeologist that worked on it worked for the Smithsonian and just got swamped. And this was a lifetime project of theirs to finally get all this information out. And unfortunately, that archaeologist passed away. And so our big goal here at DMNS is to reevaluate the manuscript and update it using modern techniques. So kind of taking these 1970s archaeological methods and applying modern archaeological inquiry to understanding the site, because this is one of the largest bison kills in North America. It is extraordinarily important, and archaeologists have been waiting like 4 decades to be able to have this information. So it's amazing that I get to work on a site that is very important to North American archaeology, and be able to work towards getting it accessible to the public.
That is incredible. I am continually surprised with all of these science division lives that I've done to really see the depth and breadth of cutting edge science that we do at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And I have to say, Carlton, your expertise and your efforts in this, I'm very appreciative of this. I mean, I just, being somebody who's always in working with the public at the museum, I feel like it's nice to have an opportunity for experts like you to share the work that you contribute to our world-class museum. And I, thank you for working with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for providing the opportunity, like scholars like myself, to show the public the amazing work that's being conducted here at the museum.
It is our pleasure, and thank you all out there for joining us today for Science Division Live. If you missed any of the program, it will be posted to YouTube later. Thank you for those wonderful questions. Carlton, thank you again for joining us for Science Division Live. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody has a good rest of their day today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.